On this episode of Newt's World, imagine making a movie in the middle of a global pandemic, forcing it to shut down twice, waiting for an actor's strike to end, and then hoping people will feel comfortable returning to movie theaters again. This is what the producers, directors, and actors of the Reagan movie endured to bring it to the screen. Reagan, starring Dennis Quaid, was released in theaters on August 30th, 2024. The historical drama follows President Ronald Reagan's life from his impoverished childhood and Hollywood stardom to his role as President of the United States. Reagan is now available to stream on Amazon Prime, YouTube, and Apple TV. Reagan film producer Mark Joseph has released a new book about the film called Making Reagan, which follows the 2-decade journey to make the film. Mark, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Well, thank you for having me, Mr. Speaker.
So I have to ask you, why did you decide that you had to tell Reagan's story?
Well, I begin the book with driving myself in a minivan with my wife and 4 young daughters between the age of 1 and 6 or something like that, driving through Illinois to my cousin's wedding, and I'm pulled over for speeding. And I look at the ticket, and it says, first of all, you must appear in court in person, because I was caught in a speed trap, and I was so far over the speed limit. But I looked at the ticket, and it said, you must appear in Dixon, Illinois. And I realized for the first time that I was driving through Ronald Reagan's hometown, unaware of that. But it left me with having to spend the night in Dixon to face the judge the next day for this horrific crime of mine. And I had 24 hours to kill in Dixon, and that was the genesis of the whole idea. But what made me think about a movie especially was just realizing Dixon is a very, very normal place. All I could see was a Holiday Inn, a gas station, and a Pizza Hut. But it just showed, again, where our leaders come from very normal places. Prime ministers of other countries, the job is handed to them by their father or grandfather. But most of our leaders come from ordinary places like Dixon, and that was my inspiration.
I've been studying Reagan, working with Reagan, campaigning with Reagan. Actually, for about 6 decades, I was shocked to realize. But you have a story I had never heard about 11-year-old Ronald Reagan. Share with us how decisive this was in shaping him.
Paul Kengor had a couple of books that were so interesting. But what really interested me about Kengor, I have a friend named Terry Mattingly who's a religion columnist, and Terry will often say that religion is often the ghost in people's stories because it explains things about them. Whether it's Michael Jackson, wanting to hold on to childhood because he wasn't allowed to celebrate his birthdays as a kid or Christmas, or Ronald Reagan, it often is an explanation for why people behave. And in particular with Reagan, Kengor had gone to the church that Reagan grew up in and asked if he could see the sermons that young Ronald Reagan heard as a child. Well, the pastor said, amazingly, think of all the books written on Ronald Reagan, he said nobody has ever asked to see them before. They're in the basement in a box. And so that's where Kengor found all these things. And he found out that Reagan's pastor was very anti-communist, which explains a lot of Reagan's life. Reagan was about 11 and a half. I think he had just found his dad, Jack, drunk in the snow, I think fairly recently. And I think his mother realized, I've got to give this kid something or he's going to grow up to be just like Dad. And so she found this book. Our hypothesis with Pastor gave it to the mother, but she gives it to her son. It's called That Printer of Udell's. And it's a rather unremarkable fiction book written by a religious author, but it turns out to be a turning point in young Reagan's life. And the hero of the book is a young man whose father is an alcoholic, and the young man finds God and grows up to become, amazingly, a United States congressman. And so Reagan reads this book at 11 and a half, and he goes to his mother, and he says, I want to declare my faith and be baptized. What I couldn't figure out was he couldn't wait. The pastor said, well, you have to wait till you're 12 in our denomination, Disciples of Christ. And he insisted he had to be baptized at 11 and a half, and he convinced the preacher to do it. That always mystified me. What's the rush? Can't you wait 6 months? But that denomination really equates salvation with baptism. And so I think in young Ronald Reagan's mind, he couldn't go 6 months in this unclear state And so he wanted to be baptized. But that really turned his life around. And instead of becoming a congressman, he goes to Hollywood detours and becomes president.
I'd never seen the story before. It does help explain a lot. Now, when did you decide you had to make the movie?
I was working at a company called Walden Media. We had done the Chronicles of Narnia, Ray, Because of Winn-Dixie Holes, and all these fun movies. And I really wanted to make it there. But the owner of the company, it was too political for him. And so I realized I had to kind of leave and develop it on my own. So that was about the time this incident in Dixon happened. And I carefully was watching other attempts to make Reagan movies. And interestingly, Reagan's fans, as you probably know, are incredibly protective of their man. And so anytime Hollywood would try to make a movie, they would come out in force against it often. With reason, they were suspicious of those of us in Hollywood. And so when James Brolin made a movie called The Reagans, they came out against that one and essentially forced CBS to move it from Showtime to CBS, and it really didn't do very well. And then a few years later, Will Ferrell announced that he was going to make a Reagan movie. And the whole joke was that Ronald Reagan had Alzheimer's as president, and they had to convince him that he was acting in a movie to get his job done as president. Well, this lasted about 48 hours before poor Will Ferrell had to pull out of that one because, again, Reagan fans were so vocal. In fact, the reason I know this, Mr. Speaker, is that our page, people thought our Facebook page was the movie's Facebook page. And I remember somebody put on our Facebook page, Will Ferrell graduated from such and such high school. He's on the wall of fame at his high school. Please call this number and demand he be taken off the wall of fame at his high school. So you can imagine the pressure that poor Will Ferrell was feeling from Reagan's devotees. So that project ended in 48 hours. Michael Douglas was announced as a Reagan film, but the fans were not happy about that. So it left a space open to us. And, I think that his fans realized pretty quickly that we weren't out to destroy him. We were out to just tell the story fairly. I spent a lot of time with people that knew President Reagan and Ronald Reagan as governor. But at the same time, we were also very careful not to align ourselves with anybody. For instance, the Reagan Library and Foundation, they were good to us, but we had no official relationship. They didn't approve of scripts or anything like that. I wanted the film goer to know that we had kept the integrity of not being bound to anybody, but just to tell the story fairly.
Now you're off on your own. How hard was it to raise the money?
Well, a good chunk of the book is about that process. It's very interesting. Between conservatives and liberals, I think it's fairly obvious that liberals handle media much better and believe in it. There's a reason that George Soros is involved in funding Sundance and different film festivals. He understands the power of it. So it wasn't like there was people lining up to fund this venture. And so we had to do it the old-fashioned way, was really finding groups, some film-related and others, that wanted to get behind it. But it was a long process. But yeah, as a general rule, I think that the political left understands how to move public opinion better than the political right does. I think the political right thinks if I can just convince you of the correctness of my ideas, you'll come over, whereas the political left understands to tell me a story. And that was something Ronald Reagan understood very well, too, of course.
Were people writing large checks, or what was happening?
We had a big range, but we didn't want to crowdfund. I didn't want to do that. That just did not seem appropriate for a Reagan story. So it was entities, individuals, and some film-related folks, people that know film. And then we had a credible opportunity with the state of Oklahoma, which I think about 37% they will give you tax rebates at the time. So that was terrific. We shot in Oklahoma. The governor was very helpful. But a good chunk of the budget came from those tax rebates from Oklahoma.
Was there ever a point where you thought this is just too hard and consider walking off?
Every other day. It shouldn't have taken me 19 years to make this movie, but we had so many delays along the way. And as I talk about in the book, some funders would pull out, and some people were just kind of posing as funders, and I eventually would smoke them out. But just the delays we had along the way. To make a movie, all your stars have to align. You have to have the talent ready, you have to have the financing ready, the distribution. So you can get 2 or 3 on board and 1 or 2 are not ready. And so you have to wait for the other 2 parts to come to fruition. So once we sort of had our act together and were ready to go, then COVID struck. I was thinking about, was it George W. Bush that had a book called Decision Points, I think it was. And I had one of those decision points when COVID struck. And I remember my co-producer John Sullivan came to me and said, we have a decision to make. Do we go or not go? And literally, we began shooting in September of 2020, right in the smack middle of COVID. Everybody else had the common sense to wait until it was over. But I remember thinking, Mr. Speaker, that I have friends who are dying around me, literally. And I thought how pathetic of a creature I'd be if I died almost making this movie. And so I said, let's go for it. And we don't know what that means. It cost us about an extra $2 million just because of all the precautions that had to be taken. Essentially, the set is a medical clinic, basically. Every day, it's taking an extra hour or so to get everybody tested every single day. And then we had COVID breakouts in the set. So because of the CDC guidelines, anytime one person got COVID, the entire set had to shut down for 10 days, which, of course, makes no sense. Normally, you would contact trace it. So we shut down twice, 20 days. And we have to pay salaries during that time. So it just made it exceedingly difficult. Then we also, because of that, we were delayed by about 8 months because we couldn't shoot the young Reagan lifeguard scenes. It was too cold now. So we had to wait till the following spring to shoot those. And just when you think we're ready to go, then the actors' strike hits. And so we had about 108 days of an actors' strike. In the meantime, I'm carefully monitoring the public opinion polls about are people ready to go back to theaters. And so that was initially very high, that something like 40% did not want to go back to a theater because it was too dangerous still. So I waited till that got down to single digits, about 8%, before we released the film. Also, I should mention the Russia-Ukraine war even affected us because we had vendors from some of those countries and we had to cancel all those contracts. So it was really one thing after another.
All this, in order to make a film, you also have to have a script. And to do that, you've got to talk to people who knew Reagan.
Yep.
So how did that go?
Yeah, I spent time with, I don't think you and I intersected, but I spent time with about 50 of the folks from Ed Meese to George Shultz. And Ed was the only person that read the script. He was the one that I think kind of represented that Reagan-dom. And he had just one note. His one note was that Jack, Reagan's dad, we were probably a little bit harsh in the first draft. You know, he said, from all that I know, I think Reagan's dad was more of a likable drunk, not a mean drunk. And so we revised that a little bit to try to make that accurate. But from Justice Kennedy, Justice Scalia, to folks that worked with him and knew him, we just got a lot of their stories in and just little snippets here and there that helped us to develop the character. George Shultz, it was good. If you notice in the film, you know, you'll see that Shultz and Reagan have a confrontational moment. And we talked about that. And, you know, he wasn't necessarily a true believer. He was more in the moderate camp. And so it was great to have that conflict as well between the kind of the Reaganite part of the operation, maybe the Dana Rohrabacher types, Peter Robinson types, and the George Shultz types, to have that conflict happening as well. And I would have people tell me stories. And I remember one in particular, one of his aides, I said, look, everybody's saying Reagan is so nice and so perfect and so great. And I said, you've got to give me some humanity here. Would he ever lose his temper? He said, yeah. He said he would lose his temper, but very quickly be a flash of temper and then it'd be over. I said, well, give me an example. And he said, well, one day I gave him his schedule and he looked at the schedule and he said he threw his glasses down across the table and he said, guys, I cannot do all this in one day. Then it quickly passed. So that was helpful because you want to make sure you have the full humanity of the person.
I noticed that you chatted with John Barletta. I found him to be an endless number of good stories about Reagan as a human being. And I was delighted that you had a chance to talk with John.
Yeah, I spent time with John. I also brought Dennis Quaid to meet John as well, and they had some good time together. You know, it's really unfortunate. He passed away from cancer before we could shoot the movie, but he died just before we began shooting. But he sat down with us and recounted the last ride. The film ends with that last horse ride. Now, in real life, the ride happened the day before, not the day after, because once they had that conversation, Reagan never wrote again. But this is a movie, not a documentary, so we'd have a little fun with that. But John was really helpful. He told us that Reagan was more religious than the public thinks. And he considered the ranch his outdoor cathedral, and they would have very deep conversations about faith. I should mention that we hired a terrific actor to play him called Trevor Donovan. And the night before, I had Trevor call Barletta's sister And they had a nice chat. And she said, "You're doing a Boston accent, aren't you?" And poor Trevor said, "Yes." And he spent the next 24 hours getting a Boston accent down and did a great job for us.
Well, Barletta told me this great story about early on, they're at the ranch, and Reagan goes out riding. Suddenly, they hear shots. And, the Secret Service goes crazy. People yell shots. They all rally. Well, Reagan was wearing a pistol. He was shooting at crows that were sitting on the line.
Yeah, we actually shot that scene. It just didn't make the final cut.
I'm curious, in terms of making a movie, why did that not make the cut?
We have a process that we go through. There's the cut that I want to show the world, and there's the cut that the world wants to see. And so part of being a filmmaker is just coming to terms with that reality. And so we screened the film for 3,000 people in 11 states leading up to the release. And it helped us work out the kinks. There's a reason the film is at a 98% approval rating at Rotten Tomatoes, and that's because we worked out a lot of the things earlier that people were having a problem with. And that was one of them. But I would say the biggest issue was originally we didn't meet Dennis Quaid until about 25 minutes into the film. Our Genius test audiences were saying, "Hey, I came here to see Dennis Quaid as Ronald Reagan. What's going on here? Well, how come I'm not seeing him for 25 minutes? And so we realized, yeah, that's probably a mistake. So we brought the assassination attempt around to the beginning. But it's just a process you go through. And maybe someday we'll have a highlight reel or something. But it's a fun scene. Also, I should mention on Barletta, a couple things that come to mind since you asked about him. First was he told me one day he came in and he saw Ronald Reagan and Henry Fonda commiserating about how their daughters didn't share their political beliefs. I thought that was kind of a funny thing for him to observe. And the second was, as part of our research, came across a fellow who said he was in a group at church that, amazingly enough, think about this, Mr. Speaker. So Reagan is president for 8 years. He comes back to his home church in Los Angeles, and the pastor, Don Muma, makes him retake the membership courses of his church because he hadn't been around for 8 years. So he made him retake the 6-week course with new members. And so one of the members in the group said that Reagan had told them, the entire group, that he had met with Hinckley personally to forgive him. And of course, I'd never heard this, and you probably haven't heard this. And so I checked with Barletta, and he said, to my knowledge, it didn't happen, but he could have snuck behind my back and done it. But he checked with Mrs. Reagan. She had never heard of that. I checked with the head of St. Elizabeth's Hospital where Hinckley was, the mental institution. And amazingly, he did tell me that Reagan tried. He said Reagan called and said, "I'd like to meet with Hinckley." And I said, "Mr. President, please don't do that. It's a very bad idea to reward assassins with personal visits." So he says, as far as I know, it didn't happen, but it could have happened. But Barletta had no record of it either.
That's wild. Now, I also have to tell you, I didn't realize that Reagan's favorite candy was not jelly beans. It was M&Ms.
Well, don't tell the Jelly Belly folks, but no, we partnered with them. I think it was one of his aides. What was her name? She would say that he would smuggle M&Ms into his suit pockets. So I think it was both.
I mean, he had jelly beans on the desk.
That's right. For official purposes, it was jelly beans, but he had a hankering for the M&Ms, and he would, especially later after the presidency, he would try to sneak them into his coat pocket, and Nancy would find them. But the Jelly Belly folks did very, very well by Ronald Reagan. They sold a lot of jelly beans, and officially that was what he said. It helped him with smoking, to stop pipe smoking, I think it was.
Were any of the kids helpful?
They have their own projects, and so I didn't want to interfere with, they have their own documentaries and books and things, but I had met with Mike maybe 15 years ago, and so Mike had given me some stories. His feeling, too, was probably best to kind of stay away from all of us and do your thing. So I kept a respectful distance, but I hope they've had a chance to see it.
As you go through all that research, did any of it significantly change your perception of Reagan?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think all of us who are in some way in public life, we have these moments where, let's just say you've spoken to 1,000 people or 300 people, whatever, and you leave the room and you're like, oh, so glad that's over with. You know, we all have moments like that. And with Reagan, I remember it was Dana Rohrabacher who said he was exactly in public who he was in private. There was no moments like that where, so glad we're free of that guy. He would be the same person in the group as he was later when it was just the two of you. So that was interesting. I also discovered that Ronald Reagan wrote some songs. I had no idea. I sat down with Mike Kerb, who was the former lieutenant governor of California, as you know. And he says, oh, by the way, Reagan and I wrote 2 songs together. And I said, excuse me? He said, yeah, we wrote these 2 songs together in the back of a limo. He says, one day we were riding somewhere. And I said, well, do you have them? And he said, yeah. So I gave one of them to Lee Greenwood. And we have an album coming out soon of songs inspired by the film. And I had Lee rewrite some of the music and lyrics to it. And so it's called Begin the World Over Again. And literally, Ronald Reagan and Mike Curb wrote that in the back of a limo in 1976. So from the grave he speaketh, and we'll hear Ronald Reagan's lyrics, Begin the World Over Again with Lee Greenwood.
When I saw the movie, the way you used John Voight as the KGB agent, I thought it was really interesting casting. How did that come about?
Well, I wish I could take credit for it, but all I can take credit for is waking myself up. I had just hired a writer, Howie Klossner, who wrote Space Cowboys for Clint Eastwood. And, you know, the relation between a producer and a writer is one that you don't want to trample in their area. You want to let them have free reign and do their thing and at the same time, you know, guide the process. But anyway, I just hired him. I dreamed the first 10 minutes of the movie, basically, including the KGB agent and the whole thing. And I remember thinking to myself in my half awake, half asleep state, if I don't wake myself up and write this down, I will never remember this in the morning. If you've had that happen to you before, I've had that happen to me a lot. I willed myself to wake up, wrote it all out, sent it to him, and then waited for him to say, who do you think you are? Let me do my job. And instead he said, this is great. Let's run with this. And so he took that opening, came up with the whole script. As far as Voight, John and I had met years ago. It's funny, we were both at an awards ceremony, and we were both waiting for our cars to arrive out on the sidewalk. And so I told him what I was working on, and we kept in touch. But John was really helpful. He had been to the Soviet Union before and after its fall. He'd been to Russia after. And was so helpful. And what actors bring to the table is, he said, when I was there earlier, their eyes were dead. After they were free, their eyes came to life. I could see the average Russian, just something in the eyes. And that's the intangible that you can't really put on a piece of paper. And John had great stories of being there, and his mother with him, and his mother actually pestered poor Boris Yeltsin. They ran into him on the street, and his 80-something-year-old mother went up to Yeltsin and says, I'd like to have that pin you have. And he said, well, this is for members of the Duma. I can't just give it to you. She says, oh, you can get another one. Just the fun interaction that they had had. So all those personal experiences really helped us to tell the story.
I'm a big fan of Dennis Quaid. I think he's a remarkable talent. How did you settle on him to be Reagan?
You know, he was always my first choice just because there's a certain intangible factor that Dennis has. He's got that same smile, that aw shucks grin. But later I would learn that there are a lot of other similarities. His mother was also very religious. His father was also alcoholic. And, you know, Jane Wyman and Meg Ryan have a lot in common. They were sort of the up-and-coming actresses as their husbands' careers were kind of fading. And Dennis would be the first to tell you he'd go to New York City and people would be screaming his wife's name and forgetting about him walking next to her. So all these things really pointed to Dennis. Now, at the same time, because his schedule was pretty full at the time, I had to talk to other actors too. So we talked to other actors like Jim Caviezel, who played Jesus in The Passion. Gosh, a lot of actors, either their representatives or themselves, Christian Bale. Dennis was always kind of first choice. And so when his schedule opened up, that was our moment. And it took some convincing. You know, he was just really intimidated by playing this character. It's not an easy character to play. It's one thing to play Abraham Lincoln, who's going to say, that's not right. You know, nobody knows. But with Reagan, a lot of us are still alive. So it was a really daunting task for him. And what really sealed the deal for him was we went up to the Reagan Ranch together. And he just really felt Reagan's spirit there and understood the character and decided to do it.
Quaid, in a sense, comes across as Western enough that he felt right.
Yeah, he's from Houston originally, but had a ranch out in Montana, just like Reagan did with his ranch. He's got the skin of somebody who's been out at the ranch. You know, I later learned also that he and his father had listened to the 64 speech in real time driving down the highway in 1964. So that's the kind of thing where he had actually lived that with his dad. And he said his dad was putting his hand on. Every time Reagan would say to me, yeah, you go, Ronnie, it was kind of a thing. So he had that from childhood.
I thought it was a little more surprising that you had Penelope Ann Miller playing Nancy Reagan. How did that happen?
I had learned about her and seen her work, but I just didn't know what Dennis was going to say. So, I went over to his house and said, "Hey, what do you think about Penelope Ann Miller for Nancy?" And he said, "Carlito's Way." And he said, "Absolutely, that's a great choice." And so she was just somebody that we had come across and learned that she was available and that she was interested. And she really did her homework. It was really amazing. She read book after book and reached out to some of the folks that Nancy had worked with. And, in our testing that I told you we had done earlier, she and Dennis were always neck and neck at the top of people's ratings. They just felt like she really captured, I don't know how you felt about it because you knew Nancy, of course, but there was a feeling that she really kind of captured the angst and the protectiveness that Nancy had towards Ronnie.
You talk about Reagan had a crush as a teenager on Muggs Cleaver. Now, I have to tell you, I had never heard of Muggs Cleaver, and I don't know how you found this.
Well, it's so funny because I read some of the reviews, and they would call it hagiography. And, it's funny because that word never comes out if it's just about a normal person. It's only when it's Ronald Reagan. But I'm thinking, did you guys watch the same movie that I made? Because in my movie, he gets, his girlfriend from childhood love dumps him. His wife dumps him. He's washed up at 50. And he doesn't know what he's going to do with his life. So I don't know if we're watching the same movie. But no, she was the preacher's daughter and Margaret Cleaver. And they were engaged, basically. And she went off to Europe for the summer and met an American guy in Europe and came back and wrote him a Dear John letter. And so his life was full of a lot of ups and downs. And I think more than anything else, for a period of time, I had originally had John Avildsen, who was the director of Rocky, to direct Reagan. And John was 81 years old and passed away before we began shooting. But John would often tell me he was a wellspring of great advice, and I would sit with him for lunch and take notes as he was giving off these zingers. But he would tell me these great Rocky stories of how they got this scene and that scene. And he said, "Mark, don't forget that Rocky was not about boxing. Boxing happened to be his occupation. It's really the story of the man overcoming the odds." And he said, in the same way, Reagan is not about politics per se, the movie. It's about the man who happens to be politics as his occupation. But it's really about him overcoming the difficulties and the challenges that he faced. And so that really guided us throughout the process. And there's a love story here. If you're not into politics, you can still enjoy it on that level as well.
I don't know very many movies that have the gap between the rating by filmgoers and the critics. Filmgoers on Rotten Tomatoes gave Reagan a 98%, which is astonishing. And the critics gave it 18. I don't know very many other movies that have an 80-point difference.
It's the largest in history. So the previous record was 65. Not that I keep track of these things, but there was a film called Boondock Saints that was 65 points. And so we've actually applied to Guinness World Book of Records for the largest gap in history. They think it's going to be a solid one. It's a new record for them, of course. Filmgoers are really, really smart. The people are very smart. They know what's going on there. It's not possible to have an 80-point gap for the same piece of work. And so my favorite review, which I really appreciated the honesty, was one reviewer said, "I left after 20 minutes and still reviewed the movie." You got to hand it to him. I think that happened more often. The people just didn't admit it. A lot of it was about Ronald Reagan himself and what they didn't like about him.
We live in a different distribution world than when I grew up. Because when I grew up, you either made it in the movie theater or you didn't make it. Now, you've also been streaming ever since.
Yeah, we hit number one at the box office on day 8. So after our theatrical run, first of all, of course, you can buy a DVD or Blu-rays at Amazon online. But it's also streaming on Apple TV, on YouTube, and then Amazon Prime, where you can watch it. There's a number of ways to watch it. What's really great about the DVD Blu-ray package is there's 3 ways to watch it on that thing. You can buy it, and you have a DVD and a Blu-ray and a digital code in there. I joke that you can give the digital code to your grandson and then keep the Blu-ray for yourself and give the DVD to your son or daughter, and the whole family can enjoy it.
Good. Well, now I understand you're speaking at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley on April 29th.
I'm sure you've been there many, many times.
I have. Can people come to the event?
Yeah, please. We'd love to have you come. It's coming up on the 29th. It's a good operation. I've been to a number of libraries, and they do a really good job. They roll out Dead Sea Scrolls and all kinds of interesting things, and they have a pretty robust program of having speakers out there.
They do. And as I understand it, if people can't physically get to the event, they can join the event virtually by going directly to reaganfoundation.org/events.
Right. You've been there several times with your books?
Probably been there 15 times. Every time I've been, I've had a great experience. They have a wonderful team.
I should also add, Mr. Speaker, that we shot at the Reagan Library and the Reagan Ranch and the library. And because of COVID, the place was open. So we shot for, I think, maybe a week on the real Air Force One and then the real Marine One. And then the KAL shoot-down scene, that plane also as well. So to my knowledge, it's the first time that a real Air Force One has been used in a movie. It's usually a set.
I didn't realize that. That's great.
Yeah, it's a little eerie to see that he's in the exact same places that he would have been.
Well, and of course, that was when the Air Force One was a 707. It's a much smaller plane. And when you get in it, you realize that it's not exactly luxurious.
Oh, my goodness, you can't take a shower or a bath or anything in that thing. So the poor guy's traveling around the world, and good grief. You'd think they would take better care of our presidents.
But it somehow worked. Listen, I want to thank you for joining us. And your new book, Making Reagan, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And we're going to feature a link to buy it on our show page. And we're really grateful that you take this kind of time to talk with us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to my guest, Mark Joseph. You can get a link to buy his new book, Making Reagan, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.